We're going to learn React concurrent mode today. So concurrent mode is one experimental API. Experimental means you shouldn't use it for production, but it is there for a while, so I wanted to check how it works, and I have read the documentation and found that it is not very difficult to implement it. So let's go ahead and start coding. So concurrent mode is basically when you want to load components concurrently. Suppose here I have 4 components and we can load each of the components in parallel. We don't have to wait for the data for each component and start rendering. And also one more thing to remember in React, in concurrent mode, React will be able to interrupt the rendering at any point of time. If React thinks that rendering is not high priority work and something else is high priority, React will go ahead and do that. So if you check the APIs for the concurrent mode, you can see first one is the Suspense. This is used for data fetching, and this is also experimental API. To implement Suspense, you can go to this adopting concurrent mode. Here you can find a step-by-step instruction. So I have done that. I have installed the React experimental, and when you are loading the app, you need to use React unstable create root to use concurrent mode. So I'll start with the Suspense API. So Suspense API is basically one component, and inside the component you can load your actual component. This concurrent component is the first block that you can see here, and there is a fallback props in Suspense. Fallback means when data is not available, you can show the fallback. When the concurrent component is loading, that time React will show the loading indicator. This is that simple. But how does it work? So I'll go to the concurrent component. In the concurrent component, I'm doing nothing. I'm just calling on API get message. Get message is just one function that's returning nothing, a blank message. If I return something like data, the data, you can see that the data is displayed. So it's basically it is doing nothing. There is no suspense here. There is no asynchronous function data loading here. That's why it is showing the data right away. But what happens when the data is not yet loaded? That time the React should display the fallback loading indicator, right? So how will you do that? So when you're using Suspense, if your component throws something, if your component throws a promise, then React will stop the rendering. I'll show you how it works. So instead of returning one data, I'm gonna throw one promise. I'm not doing anything here. So basically I'm just throwing the promise. You can see it is showing the loading indicator. So when the concurrent component is getting rendered, this component is throwing one promise, and React will think that the data is not yet available, and it will show the fallback loading indicator. Now we'll do one more thing. I will just add one log, and I will start the console. I'll filter it with rendering. You can see only one rendering, but after the data is present, the component has to be re-rendered. How the React will know? So React will know in this way that so eventually the promise is going to be resolved, and at that point of time React will know that the data is present, and it will try to render the component again. So here I will just resolve the promise. Now if I do that, you can see React is calling the rendering again and again, because when it is finding that the promise is resolved, it is trying to render it again. So in real scenario, this will not happen, because when the data is present, the component should return the data. So to solve that, eventually the browser is crashing because it is too many rendering, right? So I will take one variable, data. Initially data is nothing, it is undefined, and in get message I will check if the data is present, then return data. And before resolving the promise, I will set the data. Now see what happens. The rendering is called twice. Why is that? Because first time the data is not present, so that time just throwing the promise, and then immediately we're resolving the promise. So React knows that data is now present, so it will go ahead and render the component again. That's why the second rendering is happening, and that time the data is present, so it is returning the data, and the component is not throwing anything and it is rendered perfectly. Now if I just immediately resolve the promise, that is not a real scenario, right? So why not you set timeout to wait for some time and then return. I will wait for 3 seconds and then you resolve it. Now see what happens. At first it is showing render loading, then the data. So this is the basics of how Suspense works. Now definitely you can see that this data is one global variable. So this is not how you will want to organize your data, right? So if you check the documentation of Suspense, you can find that you should always use Suspense with some libraries. One of such libraries is Relay, that is from Facebook. Currently Relay supports Suspense. But if you're a library developer, then definitely you can write your own library to handle the data. But this is how it works internally. I'll give a quick recap of how it is working. So here is my Suspense. It says Suspense as a fallback. And inside Suspense, I can load my component. So this component can render properly. In that case, React will not wait for anything. But if the component doesn't have the data, it should throw one promise. And React will store the promise. So immediately React will just go to the fallback and it will render the fallback. And it will store the promise. And when the promise is resolved, React will call this concurrent component again. So I'll show you the concurrent component. It is calling getMessage. GetMessage is a function. So initially I have one data. The data is undefined. So initially this getMessage will throw the promise. And after 3 seconds, we are resolving the promise and we are setting the data. So for first time, the getMessage will throw the promise, and second time, it will just return the data. So second time, the concurrent component will return just the component, it will not throw anything. I hope you found something useful in this video. Please hit like and let me know in the comment section if you have any questions or any suggestions. Thanks for watching.